Happy Thursday, Non-Obvious Nation. We are back once again for a very special edition of the Non-Obvious Insight Show at a very special time. Many of you, no matter where you are in the world, have probably been watching the unfolding of the U.S. presidential election. And as of the timing of this show, a winner has not yet been declared. The counting is still continuing. And one of the themes we're going to talk about in this show, and I've got a very special guest coming up to add some context to this, is what happens next? Where do we go from here? And that's been a big topic on my mind. And I've certainly been writing about that and reading lots and lots of stories, probably too many stories about that to put it into context. But what I want to do today is give you a few of my sort of higher level thinking and some of the higher level stories that I've been reading to try and put what's going on right now into context. I mean, that's my goal for the show and with the interview that we've got coming up. And the first story that I think really captured my attention and got me thinking about one of the fundamental aspects of the election right now is polling. And specifically the idea that we had all of these polls coming in and talking about this huge lead that Biden had. And now as the election unfolds, it sort of seems like, well, maybe those were incorrect or at least off in some ways. And as a marketer, I've relied and been part of lots of, in the marketing world, at least we call them focus groups. And they're notorious for being mistaken in the sense that a lot of times you get a bunch of people in the same room, they start influencing one another. A lot of times people don't actually know what they want. And there's legendary marketing stories about like Ford saying, people would have asked for a faster horse, right? I mean, there's all of these stories in business about that. And when it comes to polling, and you just think about like how they're done, I mean, there's people calling people at home who would have to pick up the phone, which, I mean, I don't know what kind of person picks up the phone to a kind of, a polling question, but then they've got to answer the questions and they're self-selecting certain types of people to answer those polls. And then we put so much weight behind them. And really what we saw over and over again, there's so many stories about this this week, is the way we're projecting forward who's going to have a lead or who's going to win is just so flawed. And a big part of it, I think, is because we've got to fill that news cycle, right? There's so many things happening right now and there's so many stories. And so we've got to figure out like how to determine what matters. One of my favorite infographics that kind of explained this in a way that I found really useful was this one from the New York Times that came out several weeks ago. And it was just a very simplified infographic that said, here's when the votes will be counted. And if you think about it, the number of votes that came in, the millions of votes that came in, and many of them on paper, right? I mean, if you're mailing in paper, the logical conclusion is this is going to take a little while for people to go through. And if you look at some of the images in the news right now of people physically sitting there opening these envelopes with their gloves on, I mean, that is a time-consuming thing. This is not a database that just gets immediately sorted electronically. And so as you put those things into context, I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is just like we're filling empty space. And it was one of the reasons why I only half jokingly wrote in my email this week that I stopped watching, because it was just a guy standing in front of a big iPad, basically clicking buttons and trying to talk about what might happen. And repeating how many number of votes you needed in order to win the Electoral College. And that just seemed like this sort of colossal spending of time, because we had to spend the time. We had to do something. You had to keep talking about it. And, another story that kind of gave me context was totally unrelated to the election, but it was a great article in Wired magazine this week that talked about printers and why printers in 2020 still suck. Which is a really good question if you think about it, because like how many times do you try and print something and like it doesn't connect properly, or like the printer has some sort of error, or you run low on ink and then you can't get the right ink, and you've got to get like exactly the printer specified ink for the thing, and like we should have solved this problem, right? We should have technology that is better, that makes printing easier. And one of the things I uncovered as I was reading that article was just Wired went and they interviewed all of these IT pros. And what they would all talk about is we can set up these amazing networks, we can do Wi-Fi, we can create all the security, but as soon as we've got to connect that to a printer that takes ink and like puts it on paper, that's actually really hard to get right. And there's a lot of moving pieces in that. And it's sort of like if you ever had a convertible. There's so many more things that go wrong with a convertible than a regular car because there's so many more moving pieces. And we forget that. And so it's easy to be like, well, we should have better printers. Like, why don't we? And what this story reminded me of is like hard things are hard. Like they're hard for a reason. And maybe nobody's figured it out because it's hard. And that I think is also important context for right now because like we want quick answers. We want like fast solutions, right? And we don't get them because it takes a while to figure out something hard. And so one of the things that I think is an outcome of this is I'm remembering how important patience actually is, which in my life at least is a good lesson to learn, but for all of us probably is too. So anyway, there were other things on the ballot, as I think it's easy to forget, besides choosing president. There were other people running for other things, and there were also ballot initiatives. So there were different issues in different states, and one of the ones that I think was really interesting was a ballot issue in Massachusetts. And what this issue talked about was whether we as consumers have the right to repair, and in this case, right to repair our cars. And what it was talking about is there's a code. Many people know this. There's a diagnostic code that comes up in your car to tell a mechanic what is wrong with the car. And those can either be standardized or they can be proprietary to certain types of cars and therefore certain types of dealers or certain types of mechanics. And what this ballot initiative essentially decided was people expect that will be standardized so that you can go to anybody to fix your car. But more broadly, it was a win for this movement that's been growing in steam around the right to repair, which has been really vocal about taking on companies like Apple that have their devices that are basically bricked. I mean, you can't go and fix an Apple device. Really, you have to go to someone to try and fix it, pay a ton of money, or you just toss it out, which is terrible for the environment and terrible for your wallet too. And so ballot initiatives like this, I think, are really interesting in the direction that they suggest we might be going in as a culture. Because if we do start going in this direction of allowing of the manufacturers of things, allowing people to fix them instead of toss them, that's really important. It's important for the environment, but it's also important for like the second life of devices, which is super, super valuable so that we can take these things that now are just ending up in a landfill and give them another life and give them another opportunity to be something useful. I want to talk about a story not related, well, sort of not related to the election this week as well, which was from one of my favorite websites called Atlas Obscura, and it's all about comfort food. And this story talked about the history of comfort food throughout the world, really. And they shared lots of very unique examples of the ways that people used comfort food or came up with things to eat to make themselves feel better. And look, that may be a totally relevant message for you right now. If you've been binging on maybe Halloween candy or whatever else is around the house as you're sitting there watching TV telling you nothing, that may have been a common experience this week. I mean, I think it kind of was for us at least. But comfort food has this really deep history of reflecting the time that it was created in. And they had some really interesting examples of this. So there was a time, for example, when they used to use Campbell's tomato soup as part of the mixture for cake batter, which sounds like it would be disgusting, but apparently it adds like a really unique and not that bad flavor to cakes, and people still do it today. So that seems like one of those TikTok recipes, right? We've become a household that has tried way too many of these TikTok recipes over the last several weeks. We've tried cloud bread, which was disgusting. We tried lemon candy that ended pitifully badly because you're supposed to slow cook it, and I forgot that it was on the stove, so like that did not end well. But like all of these things are experiments in using food to kind of pass the time, but also kind of to make us feel better. And I think that was one of those ideas that just united us together because like we all need some comfort food. Like we all could benefit from that. Last story I want to share before we go to the interview and just talking a little bit more deeply about what's going on right now with the election is the worst tweet of the week and maybe of the election cycle. But it was the Gap, tweeting about a sweatshirt and talking about how the sweatshirt could bring people together. And that was funny and dumb on many levels. And one of the levels that it was not too smart on was just trying to minimizing what was going on right now. And so they predictably got skewered on social media. But one of the reasons why they got skewered was so funny for me as a brand and design guy. Lots and lots of people were apparently really angry because the A in this sweatshirt and this image doesn't actually line up properly. And they're like, look, you created this whole thing. Like, the least you could do is make the A line up. I mean, come on. Like, how hard would that have been, right? And I just love that in a moment when, like, we just feel this anger, like, maybe we could just direct it towards something that would be innocent, right? Something that could just help us all agree that, look, we may not agree who should be president, but at least we can agree that the Gap could have made the A lineup, right? I mean, at least we can agree on that. All of these stories are from a weekly newsletter that I do every Thursday morning and send out to all of my subscribers. And if you'd like to get on that list, this is the URL to subscribe to the email newsletter. You can also subscribe directly to my YouTube channel. If you're watching this on YouTube, there's a little link in the corner of the screen, and you can just click that link and you can subscribe to the channel. If you're watching on one of the other platforms, it's very easy to go over to YouTube and subscribe, and you'll get notifications about the next episodes. And we've got some amazing guests coming up every Thursday as we talk about non-obvious ideas and perspectives. So now it is time to welcome my guest for today. Rohit Bhargava. And by the way, I have to say, before I even welcome you, that we are technically related, but we did not really know each other before today. So, it's not like I'm just bringing on a random family member. We do have the same last name, but as many of my Indian friends know, Bhargava is kind of a common Indian last name. And so welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of the conversation. And I can't wait to talk to you.
I'm so excited to be here, in part because at least I can bring the random into the non-obvious randomness of today. So I'm adding to the random as another member of the Bhargava big family around the world. So I'm so thrilled to be here with you.
Yeah, you definitely are. And I think that you've got a very fascinating perspective on kind of what's going on right now. So you've got your own organization. You've been involved in politics. You've been involved in this election period right now. For people who are not familiar with your background, share a little bit about kind of what you've been doing over the last several years, and specifically what you're doing right now with Anthem of Us.
Sure. So I am by trade a civil rights lawyer who was in the Obama administration and led civil rights in schools and colleges and universities at the Justice Department. I have transformed myself into a justice ninja over the last couple of years, and I've been basically trying to go figure out where we can fix problems, and have landed on many different things. So I spend some of my time on advising everything from arts organizations and foundations and companies and media, big media organizations on how we actually center justice and equity. One of the things that I found around the country, especially around Me Too and some of the racial reckoning that were happening, is that people spend a lot of time talking about the incident that happened, the moment of discrimination and violence, and not what leads up to it and what comes after it. And so how do we actually build some environments better that people can actually thrive in and feel safe, and that their dignity and the sense of justice is respected in. So that's what I've been doing as a day job, which most people have no idea I have a day job, because the things I talk about are, I was on the DNC platform committee. I do a ton of work on elections and campaigns, mostly informally, because I just like to go and figure out where we can fix things. So I was in Alabama in 2017. I was in Arizona in 2018. And this year just really wanted to help people figure out what are the races we need to be focused on? How do we volunteer? What are the ways in which we can actually get the vote out in the time when there's a lot of confusing information? So put out election guides, did a lot of organizing around where people can plug in, and also advising to campaigns. And so it's been a crazy couple of months. I think I ran so hard through the finish line that I hit the wall. So here we are.
I'm amazed you're even awake right now. I mean, I feel like this would be your moment of being 24/7 into it.
Yeah.
I wonder though, I mean, my first question, I guess, is just having had your ear to the ground and been involved on a local level in so many different localities, are you surprised at what's happening right now? Or is this kind of what you expected? I mean, where does it fall on the spectrum of, wow, I never thought today would be like this versus, yeah, we kind of knew?
So I think there's a couple things. And by the way, I think that your printer, your right to repair and the comfort food are all part of this election, right? So why is it so hard? It's like the question of this election. Why are we making it so hard for people to actually be able to vote and to figure this out? And why do we have thousands upon thousands of us trying to help people figure out how to vote in a country that's supposed to be, we should be much better than this, and it should not be so archaic, and we should not have systems. Florida's voter registration system completely fails on the last day of voter registration, so 70,000 people don't get to register to vote. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? So there's the printer problem. There's the right to repair problem, which is people are spending. We're doing this right now, right? Trying to actually repair the things that might not have worked for folks, and again, because it's complicated. But why can't there just be one place and we can figure that out, and it doesn't have to be, a mess and everyone's going to different county locations and states and everything else to figure out how we fix this. So I think this is all all of the craziness and the random world is totally part of this election right now. And I think what surprises me is that, I got to say, I would like to say that I wasn't heartbroken on election night. I am, and I am because I don't understand, and as someone who spent a lot of time in parts of this country and spends a lot of time with conservative leaders, and it's not that I'm living in a complete bubble, though I certainly in COVID we haven't been out in the field in quite the same way. Yet I still am surprised that in a time where we have so many people who've died in this time that didn't need to, where we have an economy that we're going to have taxes raised because of Trump tax bills. We know that the narrative of law and order at a time when hate is being actually stoked and celebrated, and violence is being stoked and celebrated by the very person who's saying law and order. None of that. It was hard for me to see that many million people, particularly women, right, where we've seen the kind of energy around women.
Well, do you think, I mean, I wonder about this, right? I mean, I think the current vote, like I said, at the time that we are doing this show, we haven't heard that there's a winner yet. But, what we do know is that probably more than 60 million people voted for both candidates, more than almost 70 million for both. Do you think that the almost or perhaps over 70 million people who voted for Trump are sort of uniformly saying we believe in all of these things, or do you think they're sort of segmented into, maybe the ones that we hear about most frequently, who are deeply racist, who just believe those things, and then there's maybe a wider population of people who voted for him despite that, right?
Yeah, so I think there's a way in which there's a question of which interests are taking priority, right? And I think in some ways the interest, the economic interest, the perceived economic interest of some, and I think part of the issue is just how do we message this out, which is that I don't think it's an economic interest of many middle class, small business owners and others to have voted for Trump, even though that was the message they got, right? And there wasn't a counter to it. So that interest trumped that of the kind of divisive, hateful, frankly, the complete destruction of legal institutions, of the law, of the ways in which we have norms in society. All of that was trumped by this perceived economic interest in some ways. Although we're gonna figure out how this is unpacked. I mean, this is going to be a long conversation. I think there's a lot to be thought about and understood. And at the same time, I think there's something to be said for what we understand about each other, and and frankly, for me, Sinclair, even more so than Fox News and so many other things that we talk about, which has taken over so much of the radio and the TV and the local TV stations around the country, how those are places, along with the disinformation. I did some disinformation briefings yesterday. The ways in which disinformation went out in this campaign, maybe not the Russians were in here, but really just information that didn't have any basis in reality, from laptops to otherwise, like that stuff is out there, and it really you really are in a situation where the worldview of the country is split in really problematic ways. And I'm not saying, we all have the things that we want to confirm our own biases and our own beliefs, and so we have to think about that. But there's ways in which I think we really have to look at media and culture and information even more so than politics and economics.
Yeah, so I mean, let's talk about the media specifically, because one of the things I read, which was really interesting, was an article from The Guardian, which is a British paper, and one of the things the journalist said is, wow, essentially his point was, wow, the Democrats have really screwed this up, because they had a climate where there's lots of negative stuff happening in the country. There is a media culture that is almost seems entirely or mainly against Trump and reports negatively on him. And yet, despite all of those assets, they still couldn't get a wider margin and make this less of a close election. And it struck me as I was reading that he was counting the media reporting negatively about the negative things that Trump does as an asset, when in fact, I think in many cases, that negativity has fueled Trump being able to play a victim and being able to share that narrative of, look at how many people are attacking me. They're attacking me on my taxes. They're attacking me on my handling of the coronavirus. They're attacking me on everything. And so I'm the victim here. And to some degree, I think that messaging has resonated for people, because when you do open any of these papers, you do see relatively negative stories about him, because he's doing negative things. But that opens up the opportunity for someone, I think, to successfully say, I'm being victimized and that's unfair.
Yeah, and also for people around the country to feel like they're being victimized, which we all do by the fact that we're sitting in a pandemic that is, and also sitting in a time where economically there's a lot of uncertainty. I think part of what happened is, like, people they want to feel like enough. Like, we want someone to tell us, like, everything's going to be fine, even though all indications from the news and the media and everything else could be different, right? That, like, you could just focus on a couple of different things and not have to actually work on systemic racism and oppression, not work on, like, what's going on with the economy and worry about everyone else around you. Like, if you can just, we can tell you a narrative that's going to be one of, like, we're going to be great again, and things are rounding the corner and it's going to be fine, right? And I think there's a lot of people who want to believe that, because it's been a lot for a while now, right? And so I think in some ways, when we were thinking about what to put out in the world, talking about the hate and the hate crimes and the divides, like, people don't necessarily want to hear all of that right now, because it's fueling the sense that, like, we're unsafe and this fear. And this is an election that was a lot about fear. And how do you actually make people get away from the fear and get safe again?
Yeah, I think that definitely fear was used as a motivator and perhaps a manipulator. But I think also there was this disconnect between, when you see a big rally or you see something happening with a lot of violence, but then you walk outside your house and, like, it's not right there. There's a disconnect between sort of what we generally see and then this extreme version of what we see, because it makes for compelling headlines. It makes for something that is compelling to watch. And it's sort of like like when you're driving past the car accident, like, there's a very small number of people who drive right by the accident and don't kind of check it out, see what happened. Right. Yeah. Rubberneck. And to some degree, like, that fuels a lot of the attention, and it becomes, if we were to cast blame, right, and say, look, the entire traffic is slowing down because we're all rubbernecking, like, I think to some degree, all of us have to take some responsibility to say, look, we could have driven by without looking. We could have chosen to turn it off. We could have chosen to not read it or not share it on social media. And instead, we have done the opposite. And therefore, we create this kind of bubble, and it extends outwards. And I wonder, one thing that you said, which was really interesting to me, was you spent time in a lot of different places. And in particular, you spent time in Alabama. And I'm wondering, like, in the context of what you've done for the elections, and to kind of help understand, and I assume persuade people in different places, what did you learn from being in Alabama that somebody who's spent all of their time in New York or Boston or DC or Seattle or any of the big cities doesn't know or doesn't understand? Because, like, not everyone takes the time or makes the choice to go and do that, to go be there.
So there's two things about Alabama, and then I want to say something about Charlottesville. So the two things about Alabama are, one, that I went to places like Anniston, Alabama, which has a long and deep history. And our New York Times or Washington Post was reporting 6 out of 10 people at a Walmart in Anniston didn't know that there was an election in 2017. So I went there and I knocked on doors, and every single person knew there was an election. And the person in the pickup who was dealing, knew that there was an election, right? The thing that they said to me was, no one has knocked on my door in 40 years. And so part of this is to believe that, like, communities organized in Alabama in 2017, and they have in Georgia, they have in many parts of this country, that in ways that we don't really have a sense of or acknowledge. And so we think we're going to pour millions of dollars into states, and that's going to turn into votes. And frankly, what's turning into votes and what's turning into people actually engaging are what has always been the case, which is that people local on the ground are doing it, right? And so that's one. The second thing I would say about Alabama is I had a lot of conversations with very conservative friends of mine who are columnists, who are political, who've been in politics in Alabama. I did a lot of civil rights cases in Alabama, and that's part of the reason I went down there. And they said to me, like, abortion is going to be it. And I was like, I couldn't believe that abortion would trump pedophilia, racism, what we saw in 2017. And in fact, that was true, right? And so part of it is that when I knocked on doors, it was a single issue. And how do you think about how to talk about that single issue? And so for us, it was to talk about it in a way that said, look, this election doesn't have that much to do with that issue, right? And not to say, like, we're going to contend with you on that issue, but more about, like, what does politics really have to do with that issue, as opposed to what it means to have people who lead, who have character. What I want to say about Charlottesville really quickly is that I went to Charlottesville after August 12th, and basically spent time in the community. And the thing that struck me was that beyond what we saw there, in terms of the violence, in terms of the hate, in terms of all of the white supremacists and others coming out, was also the way in which a community came together. And I mean dishwashers, I mean people who were professors, I mean students, I mean community people who had not ever joined together, and they trained together in nonviolence, and they stood together. And there was a way in which we don't bother to ever tell those stories. We tell the stories of all of the things that came into Charlottesville, but we don't tell the story of what it meant for a 63-year-old African-American woman whose son was the one who was hit by the car and flown into the air. But what she said to me was, I never really worried about race all that much, but I came out because this was our time when I trained with everyone. And that day I heard someone say to me, I know it's going to be harder for you out here, so I'm going to stand in front of you and give my life for you, right? And she's like, I don't know today. Wow. Whether if I look at a white person, they're the person who's going to stand in front of me and give their life for me, or they're the person who actually wants to kill me. She's like, that's where we are in America right now. And I think that's something that we need to spend some time on, which is, what are the ways in which communities are coming together? We've seen this time and time again, which is we have extraordinary violence. We have extraordinary violence in this country multiple times, but once that violence subsides, we don't bother with the story. How do communities repair themselves? How do they actually find a way to come out of Portland, or where there wasn't even the kind of violence that people are talking about? I mean, the fact that on election day, one of the things that I got a whole bunch of requests about was like, hey, I heard in DC there's BLM protesters and there's violence with police. And so I was like, talking to all my friends in DC, like, what's going on? And they were like, there's 2 pandas running around, and there's people playing pop and rock, and there's people reading out of a Bible, and there's a whole bunch of people dancing. And I was like, this is a way in which it became a narrative of BLM protesters and the police. Like, we are not telling the stories of, like, the ways in which we're keeping people together, because those are not.
We're not offering the perspective, like, I remember I voted early in Virginia, where I live, and I posted a photo of voting early, and I took my youngest son with me. and we waited in line, and the whole process, kind of start to finish, from the moment we got out of our car to the moment I finished voting, took 56 minutes. And along the way, there was a Republican table, there was a Democrat table. They were kind of, just had their information. Here's who to vote for. Here's how we would like you to vote on different propositions. At the Republican table, they gave my son a lollipop. Everybody was smiling. At the Democrat table, he picked up a sticker, an I voted sticker. He put it on, and he went all the way through with me. And it was just like, it wasn't the violence. It wasn't any of those things. And I think you're absolutely right. And you got some great press recently. In fact, you got featured in a New York Times piece, I think just yesterday or even today. I don't remember when it was. But it was all about this idea that, like, there are all of these moments of positivity, and you really kind of went viral with one of them when you shared a video that kind of told the story of when your family met Joe Biden. So maybe you can tell us that story, and maybe we can dig a little bit more into what I agree with you is an underappreciated side of what's going on right now, which is this story of just humanity, of us actually coming together.
Sure. So I had a chance to work with Vice President Biden when I was in the administration, and my parents live on the south side of Chicago, which is where I am now. They haven't had a chance to meet people like the vice president. In 2015, in May, my brother passed away, and a couple weeks later, Bo passed away. Vice President Biden's son, and so it was this extraordinary thing where we were looking for a place to grieve. I was looking to see, like, how do sisters grieve? My father was trying to figure out, what do you do when you lose a son? My mother was trying to figure out the same. And here was Joe Biden openly grieving with us. And he ended up writing a book, Promise Me Dad, which on the book tour happened to come to the south side of Chicago on the night of my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. And so I asked if we could go backstage and meet him. And it was just this extraordinary thing where we were in line, where we get there and he just stops and spends a bunch of time with my parents. And I stood off on the side and just watched that happen, of a moment of common understanding, of grief, of being part of, in his words, the same lousy club. And then he went on stage, and when asked when he wrote the book, he said, why you wrote the book? He said, it's for the kind of family I met backstage. And he talked about my brother and my family and what it meant for us to have that happen. And then a couple of weeks later, I was in Washington at the investiture for Doug Jones when he became a senator. And I saw the vice president, and I don't know what came over me, but I was like, ran over there to be like, hey, I just wanted to thank you again for what happened in December. And I was like, you probably don't remember me. And he looked at me and he was like, I remember. And he asked how my parents were and how they were doing through the holidays, and to tell them that he was thinking of them. And I just keep thinking about that when we're in the middle of, like, all of the craziness of this election, and we just decided we wanted to tell that story because that's what this is about, right? And we've got to go back to that, this is about, like, the ways in which we have common values, we have grief, we have shared journeys, we have shared promises and hopes for what it is that we want for our families and for ourselves. And in sharing that video, like there have been, there are friends of mine who have shared that their 97-year-old grandfather and 16-year-old niece who were voting for Trump, and they had spent months trying to convince them otherwise. And it was the hardest thing they'd ever had to go through, was to have those conversations with their family. And when they watched that video, her 97-year-old grandfather says, like, tell them that's my story too, and changed his vote, right? And like that. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how we need to be doing more of this, which is we're not that different from each other, right? Like, that's what people want us to feel like. But I'm a vice chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and I spend my time with my fellow commissioners who are literally the heads of evangelicals for Trump, and very different politics and agendas than mine. And we found some ways, again, for us to be able to, like on immigration, I've said, like, we hear totally different things. Like, we have totally different understandings of what's happening in immigration in this country. So, like, what happens if we travel somewhere and see the same things together? Because I have to believe that our values ultimately are not that different, and something else is going on, right? So
yeah, we don't. You're absolutely right. I mean, we don't get enough chances to humanize this, and it becomes really easy to just see what somebody shares on social media, and especially now during the pandemic, right, where we're not actually physically getting together and we're not able to do any of that. And I'm reminded just in what you've been talking about, the importance of stories and using those stories to offer this human side, to say, look, this isn't just about kind of what we see as the story in the media. It's about some sort of personal experience. It's about some sort of reason why we choose to believe something, or we choose to act in a certain way because of that connection. And I think that's always been important. That's certainly important when it comes to some of the deep canvassing, as I think it's called in the industry that you're talking about, of having those face-to-face conversations with people. And hopefully that is something that comes out of this. So thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with me. My guest today, Anurima Bhargava, again, not closely related, but we do have the same name.
We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out.
Guest today. Yes.
Cousin. I'm going to call you cousin.
Yeah, we will. You know, in India, we're all cousins, so you know that's how it rolls. And maybe in America, like we'll all be in this together at some point too, which is kind of the theme of this. So, thank you for sharing some of your stories, some of your insights. We are talking about the election. We're talking about non-obvious perspectives, and you just heard lots of great stories about maybe some optimism and some hope for the future. So. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today for another edition of the Non-Obvious Insights Show. We will be back again next Thursday with another fascinating guest to talk about how to bring more non-obvious thinking into our world. Hopefully, we'll have a presidential determination at that point of who's actually won the election. So thank you for joining me today. Thank you for being part of this. And remember, always stay non-obvious.